Have you ever wondered if addiction isn't so much about the substance, but about absence? Not the absence of willpower, not the absence of discipline, but the absence of something far older, far more essential, a presence we should have known long before we even had words. When we think of addiction, we picture a syringe, a bottle, a glowing screen in the dead of night. We imagine compulsion, shame, secrecy. Yet behind these images lies a truth that is harder to name. Addiction is not the beginning of the story. It is the conclusion of a far longer narrative, one that starts with a wound. And wounds rarely heal when ignored, they fester in the shadows. Carl Jung wrote that every form of dependency is, in a way, a substitute for a true spiritual connection. To him, the alcoholic, the compulsive, the obsessive, they were not merely weak or incapable. They were seekers, searching for infinity within the finite, trying to drink from a cup that could never quench their thirst. What they longed for was not another sip, but a return, a reunion with something lost. And yet, in the modern world, we prefer simpler explanations. We say, just stop. We say, they made bad choices. We believe that willpower alone is enough to face an ocean. But reducing addiction to a matter of choice is to misunderstand it entirely. It's to confuse the visible symptom with the invisible cause. Here lies the paradox. In most cases, addiction doesn't arise from an excessive love for a substance, but from the inability to endure life without it. It is a tragic, desperate, profoundly human attempt to regulate a pain that no one else can see. This pain is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent, lurking in the spaces of life like background noise. The absence of safety in childhood. The absence of someone who truly looked at you and saw you. The absence of a place where you could be whole without fear of abandonment. It is here that Gabor Maté, a physician who spent decades working with those society calls lost, speaks with almost surgical precision. The question is not why addiction, but why the pain. When I first read that, something inside me stopped. Because it changes everything. It suggests that before we remove the drug, the habit, the silent compulsion to swipe a screen, we must find the wound it is shielding. Without this, recovery becomes nothing more than a form of starvation. We remove the symptom, but the hunger for relief continues to gnaw from within. Perhaps this is why so many attempts at recovery fail when they rely solely on punishment, shame, or abstinence. You cannot shame a wound until it heals. You cannot punish loneliness until it disappears. And abstinence without connection is just another form of emptiness. But there is an uncomfortable truth. To truly understand addiction, to really understand it, we must confront the parts of the human story we prefer to keep in the dark. We must speak of trauma, of neglect, of love denied. We must admit that, in a world overflowing with stimuli, there remains a deep hunger for genuine connection. Perhaps this is why Jung and Maté, separated by a century yet strangely aligned, saw addiction not as an enemy to be eradicated, but as a messenger. A difficult, shadowed messenger, yet one carrying a vital truth. Something inside you is starving. Something inside you is calling to come home. If that unsettles you, perhaps it should. Because we all have our substances, our screens, our escape rituals. We all know moments when reality feels too heavy to bear without anesthesia. So when I speak of the addict, I am not speaking of them alone, I am speaking of us. Addiction is a terrain where mind and soul meet in conflict. It is not just about substances or compulsive behaviors, but about old wounds, silent voids, and misdirected searches. In this video we will dive into the perspectives of Carl Jung and Gabor Maté, two thinkers separated by time, yet arriving at complementary insights. Jung saw addiction as a distorted spiritual quest, Maté as an escape from pain. We will explore how trauma shapes dependency, how the modern world amplifies our compulsions, and above all, how true recovery goes beyond abstinence. It demands a reunion with oneself. If you're finding this video meaningful, subscribe to the channel now, and let's continue this journey together to understand the contradictions that make us human. To understand Carl Jung's perspective on addiction, we first need to grasp the central place the spirit, or what he called the self, held in his psychology. Jung did not see the human being merely as a set of behaviors or a sum of traumas. For him, each person is a field of psychic forces in motion, driven by a profound desire to become whole. He called this process individuation, the journey back to the center of one's own soul. The problem, according to Jung, is that few consciously follow this path. Often we try to fill the existential void with whatever is closest and most accessible. Substances, distractions, excesses. He believed that behind the addict's impulse lay a legitimate, though misdirected, search for transcendence. This perspective became especially clear in a famous episode of his life. In 1931, Jung was approached by a patient named Roland H., an American alcoholic who had tried every conventional form of treatment without success. After several sessions, Jung was direct. There was no hope for a cure through traditional medical means. The only path to liberation, he said, would require a profound spiritual transformation, something that could replace the need for alcohol with a higher sense of connection. This conversation would echo years later in the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson, one of AA's creators, heard Roland's story and embraced the idea that recovery demanded a spiritual experience, not necessarily religious, but an opening to something greater than the ego. For Jung, the compulsion toward alcohol, or any form of addiction, was not merely a physical thirst, but a hunger for the infinite. The bottle, the drug, gambling, compulsive sex, all functioned as poor symbols of a lost communion. As he once wrote, "Man thirsts for a meaning that transcends life." Addiction is often the expression of a soul crying out for God. And here, God need not be understood in a dogmatic sense. For Jung, the divine could be any experience that connected the individual to the wholeness of themselves and the living web of the world. The problem is that without finding this true path, a person clings to the substitute, and the substitute never satisfies. This is why he saw recovery not as simply stopping use, but as a reorientation of desire. If the drive is toward union, connection, and meaning, then healing only occurs when we find something that genuinely fulfills that search. Without it, the inner void remains and relapse becomes almost inevitable. Yet Jung also knew this process is painful. Coming into contact with the self inevitably means confronting the shadow, those parts of ourselves we reject or deny. Many addicts avoid sobriety precisely because it removes the anesthetic and leaves us face to face with everything we've tried to forget. Perhaps, for Jung, the greatest tragedy of addiction was not physical or social destruction, but that it keeps a person forever at the margin of themselves. Like a pilgrim walking in circles, always thirsty, always sensing the spring just ahead, yet never able to drink from its waters. If Carl Jung saw addiction as a misdirected spiritual quest, Gabor Maté sees it as a silent cry of pain. Not just physical pain, but a deep-seated emotional suffering, often invisible to those looking from the outside. Gabor Maté, a Canadian physician and addiction specialist, spent decades working in Vancouver's most marginalized neighborhoods, surrounded by people struggling daily with alcohol, heroin, crack, methamphetamine, and perhaps the most destructive of all, human abandonment. His most famous line is a key that unlocks his entire philosophy. The question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. This inversion is crucial. Rather than focusing on the substance or the behavior, he seeks the origin. Because, according to Maté, addiction is merely the visible tip of an emotional iceberg. Beneath the surface lie childhood traumas, emotional absences, abuse, subtle neglect, and unhealed emotional wounds. And contrary to what many might think, these traumas are not always explicit. Sometimes what marks a person forever is not what happened, but what didn't happen. The absence of a touch, of a validating glance, of a consistent presence. The feeling of not being seen or acknowledged when it mattered most. Maté connects this to neuroscience. A child's developing brain is shaped by emotional experiences. When the environment is unsafe, cold, or inconsistent, the child learns to seek relief outside themselves. This pattern, etched into the nervous system, can later manifest as dependency on drugs, alcohol, food, sex, work, or anything that offers, even temporarily, a sense of safety and relief. For Maté, then, addiction is not the core problem. It is an attempt at a solution. A failed, yet understandable, attempt to escape a pain that feels unbearable. The drug or compulsive behavior acts as an immediate, though toxic, remedy against the sense of emptiness and disconnection. And here lies the most human aspect of Maté's perspective. He does not see the addict as morally weak or a failure. He sees them as someone who, instinctively, discovered a strategy to survive emotionally. Addiction, in this sense, is less a conscious choice and more an adaptation to adversity. The problem, of course, is that this adaptation comes at a high cost. The same relief that saves in the moment is what destroys over time. And without confronting the root, the original pain, recovery is unlikely to endure. That's why Mate insists that any healing process must be deeply compassionate. A space must be created where a person feels safe enough to revisit their wounds, understand their origins, and learn to regulate themselves emotionally without turning to the substance or compulsive habit. He states, "It is not the drug that creates addiction. It is the lack of human connection and connection to ourselves that makes us vulnerable to it." Like Jung, Mate speaks of reconnection. But while Jung points to the encounter with the self, Mate points to the reunion with one's own history, not to relive the pain but to integrate it so it no longer needs to be anesthetized. Addiction, for many, is still imagined as confined to dark alleys, syringes, hidden bottles. But the truth is, in the 21st century, it has become an official cog in the system. We live in a society that not only tolerates dependency, it cultivates it, promotes it, and turns it into profit. If Jung said that addiction is a misdirected spiritual quest, and Mate that it arises from unhealed pain, then the modern world is the ultimate provider of substitutes to fill that void. Anesthetics are everywhere, not just illicit drugs but alcohol, nicotine, pornography, social media, online shopping, ultra-processed food, gaming, compulsive work. Never in human history have we had such fast, easy, and cheap access to stimuli capable of altering our mental state. One click, one touch, one swipe on a screen is enough. The companies that dominate these markets understand something that addicts of the past also knew. The human mind is malleable and hungry. Gabor Maté warns that you don't need a genetic predisposition to become dependent in today's world. We live in a culture that drives emotional exhaustion while simultaneously offering instant distractions to cope. It's a perfect cycle. First, people are broken down by overwork, comparison, and insecurity. Then we sell them escapes that never heal, only reinforce the prison. Just look at social media. The logic is identical to that of a drug. Tiny bursts of dopamine triggered by likes, comments, and notifications. With each update, the brain expects a reward. The absence of that reward breeds anxiety, and anxiety drives us to seek more. So we swipe again and again and again. Nietzsche once wrote that, "Modern man suffers from a poverty of soul, he tries to compensate with a wealth of stimuli." Perhaps this has never been more true. We have more options for immediate pleasure than any previous generation. Yet we also live in unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and isolation. The modern world has also made addiction more silent. The early 20th century alcoholic was visible. The heroin addict too. Today, many of our addictions are socially accepted, even encouraged. No one bats an eye at someone working 70 hours a week, as long as it generates profit. No one questions 5 hours glued to a screen. After all, they're just relaxing. Carl Jung warned that the more socially accepted an addiction becomes, the more dangerous it is, because it goes unrecognized as such. The culture of performance, constant comparison, and relentless consumption has turned dependency into a lifestyle. And there's an even more unsettling aspect. The more digitally connected we are, the more emotionally disconnected we seem to be. Addiction thrives in this terrain, because at its core, it is an attempt to replace real human connection with artificial substitutes. Addiction is, by nature, a battle of opposing forces. On one side, the drive to control, the desperate attempt to master the habit, to prove to oneself and others that this time will be different. On the other, the inevitability of surrender, the moment when the addict realizes that, alone, they cannot overcome the compulsion. Here lies one of the deepest paradoxes of the healing process. To regain control over one's life, one must first accept that they have no control over the addiction. This is the essence of what Jung and decades later Alcoholics Anonymous placed at the center of recovery. Acknowledging one's own powerlessness in the face of dependency is not a sign of weakness, but the beginning of strength. For Jung, this surrender was not passive, it was a yielding to something greater than the ego. He saw addiction as a symptom of a psyche fragmented, disconnected from the self. Surrender, then, meant creating space for deeper internal forces, what he called the process of individuation, to emerge and reorganize life. Gabor Maté complements this perspective by highlighting the emotional dimension. For him, surrender is recognizing the pain that sustains the addiction. It is stopping the fight against the symptom and turning instead toward the original wound. This requires courage because it means facing painful memories, accepting vulnerabilities, and allowing oneself to feel what has been anesthetized for years. Control, in turn, comes into play after this initial surrender. Once a person acknowledges their limits in the face of a substance or compulsive behavior, it becomes possible to build strategies and routines that reinforce sobriety and emotional health. Here, control is not blind repression but conscious discipline, daily choices that construct a new way of living. This dance between control and surrender also carries a spiritual element, even for those who do not identify with religion. It is the recognition that healing is not merely stopping the use, but reconnecting with something larger. A purpose, a community, a sense of belonging. But there is a risk. Attempting to control too early without first undergoing surrender often leads to relapse. In such cases, control is merely another mask of the ego, trying to avoid contact with the wound. It is like skimming the surface of a polluted lake without addressing the source that contaminates it. In the end, both Jung and Maté seem to agree. True recovery requires the humility to surrender to what cannot be controlled, and the courage to take command of what can be transformed. It is accepting that there are forces within us we cannot tame, but that we can understand and integrate. At the heart of every addiction lies a void. It is no ordinary space, it is a hole in the soul, an echo of something lost and never found. For Jung, this void is the absence of connection with the self. For Maté, it is the mark of unhealed pain. Two different languages pointing to the same truth. Addiction is a symptom of estrangement from oneself. The paradox is that, as destructive as it is, addiction is also a call. A signal, distorted yet unmistakable, that something within us is crying out for attention. The problem is that, instead of answering this call, we seek shortcuts. Substances, behaviors, distractions, that take us even further from the source of our pain. Facing the void requires courage. Because within it, we find no quick answers or ready-made solutions. We find silence. We find questions. We find the raw truth of who we are without our anesthetics. This is why so many fear sobriety. It is not merely the absence of use but the presence of oneself. Yet it is also in this bare, uncomfortable space that reunion can occur. Reunion with one's own story, not to relive the pain but to integrate it. Reunion with others, not through masks or defenses but through genuine vulnerability. Reunion with something greater, whether nature, art, spirituality, or any form of meaning that awakens life within us. Gabor Maté says, healing begins when we become capable of listening to ourselves. Jung would say that individuation begins when we approach the self, even if it means confronting the shadow. Both seem to agree. The true escape from addiction is not a return to who we were before it, but the birth of something new. Perhaps this is why, when someone overcomes an addiction, there is a depth in their gaze that wasn't there before. It's as if they have descended into the darkest parts of themselves and returned with something precious. An understanding that cannot be taught, only lived. The void, after all, is not just a space of absence. It is also a space of creation. And if we have the courage to inhabit it, we can transform it into a place where new roots grow. If this reflection made you pause for a moment, perhaps it is because a part of you is searching for something too. Subscribe to the channel and continue with me on this journey to understand the contradictions that make us human. Because in the end, the addict searches in some way our search as well.